assigned topic is what to do with Philippine agriculture. My presentation will have really three parts: an overview, and then a series of slides with specific recommendations on how we're going to manage the institutions responsible for agriculture, and the last part on closure on some important but very contentious issues in agriculture. So, looking back, if there is any single statement that will capture our state of agriculture, this statement will go like this: all is not well with Philippine agriculture. All is not well with Philippine agriculture. Our national poverty figures remain at 26%, which is worst among the ASEAN 5, the other countries against whom we usually benchmark ourselves. And the greater part of this poverty in the Philippines is accounted for by poverty among farmers and fisherfolk in the countryside. This lack of productivity and underperformance, unfortunately, has been going on for almost 50 years. And the numbers show that consistently the growth of agriculture had been less than that of our gross domestic product. And worse, since the 1980s, our growth in agriculture is barely or has barely matched that of population growth. And this lack of productivity and underperformance are very starkly captured in our agricultural exports compared with the ASEAN 5. This table shows that we have the dubious distinction of, in fact, being the poorest in the ASEAN. Our poverty incidence remains at 26%, but our neighbors have poverty numbers much, much less. Easily a half of our poverty, with the exception of Malaysia, which has really gone very far in terms of reducing poverty. But ominously, you find that all our neighbors are taking significant progress in reducing their poverty, but ours has remained stagnant at around 26%. And as I've said earlier, the bigger part of that poverty is accounted for by the rural population. Our rural poverty numbers is 40%, which is triple that of our neighbors. But that lack of performance has been going on for some time. So the table shows here that since the 1960s or 50 years ago, the growth in agriculture has been consistently less than that of GDP, meaning agriculture is not contributing its share in economic development. And in fact, agriculture is dragging down or slowing down our economic growth. And worse, since the 1980s, agricultural growth is barely matching that of population growth. This lack of performance is captured very clearly in agri-food trade. All our neighbors are enjoying double-digit numbers in exports in $1 billion. Our exports in 2014 was a measly 7 billion, but Indonesia had 39, Malaysia 26, Thailand 38, and Vietnam 25. And again, we have the lone distinction that in terms of trade balance, all these four neighbors of ours have positive trade balance. And we are the only one who is the lone net food importer. And this can be explained by our exports per hectare. On the average, we are exporting $340 of food and agricultural products per hectare of agricultural land. Indonesia, our neighbor, which is also archipelagic in geography, exports twice as much. Malaysia exports 10 times as much. Thailand, 5, and Vietnam, 3 times as much as we export per unit hectare of land. So looking back, what are the circumstances that would explain our lack of productivity and underperformance? The politically correct explanation now is climate change, floods, typhoons, drought. And yes, those are very serious drawbacks. But these are natural causes over which we don't have much control. We can only anticipate and mitigate their consequences. But having been a student of agriculture for a number of decades already, starting 1956, when most of you are not yet born, as a student in Los Baños, up to now as a practicing farmer myself, I trace back our problems to 4 essentially man-made causes or circumstances. One is our small economic size farms, which lack economies of scale at all stages of the enterprise. We have not properly linked primary production with markets and the rest of the value chain. And so farmers always complain of low farm gate prices at the time of harvest. Unlike our neighbors, we have failed to diversify our products into other high-value products, and we have stayed on with rice, corn, and coconut, where the economic returns per hectare are small. And finally, the poorest among the poor, among Filipinos, are fisher folks and residents of coastal communities, in spite of the fact that we have, in fact, more water resources than land resources, because we have not fully exploited those resources for our purposes. But lest we become despondent and hopeless, there are a number of things going for us with which to build a foundation of a more progressive agriculture and reverse those numbers that I showed before. In the first place, we have a moderate tropical environment. We don't have winter, and therefore we can grow crops all year round. The whole of agriculture depends on water, a regular supply of water. And we are blessed with 2,400 millimeters of rain every year. If we could save that water in lakes, ponds, dams, not allow that water to flow uselessly to the sea, we should have enough water into the future. Then, of course, I mentioned that we have vast but only partially tapped fisheries and water resources. Our livestock and poultry industries, in fact, are technically competitive with our neighbors. I have looked at surveys on technical coefficients of feed conversion, egg production, things like this. So our livestock and poultry industries is quite modern, and they are competitive. And we have another thing going for us for livestock and poultry. We are free from very serious poultry and livestock diseases, and therefore we have that much potential for exports. And then finally, we are one of the countries which possess mega diversity. There's still so much genetic resources, both flora and fauna, which we have not really fully utilized. Those are those things that are going for us as far as natural resources are concerned. But there are other things we can take heart from. We have a fairly educated workforce. We have a modest but working higher education and scientific infrastructure in agriculture. In fact, years back, all our neighbors have been sending students to us for training in higher education in agriculture. We have a relatively still small but increasingly competitive food and beverage industry. Oishi, Liwayway, Universal, Robina, San Miguel, Del Monte, Emperador Brandy. Some of those Filipino brands are making waves in regional trade. And lastly, believe it or not, we have progressive legislation, policies, and appropriations, government appropriations, largely in place. It's interesting and ironic that that could be one of our strengths, because Congress, in spite of all its weaknesses, has really done its job. Over the years, they have passed comprehensive laws like the Agriculture and Fisheries Modernization Act, the Fisheries Code, the Forestry Code, the Agrarian Reform, and the Local Government Code. These are very important policies and legislations which are in place, at least in paper. In fact, in 2008, the budget of the Department of Agriculture was around 20 billion pesos. The last figure is that the DA has 90 billion pesos general appropriation. So, for the most part, the legislation, law, and appropriations are there. And what is missing all these years is, sad to say, intelligent program planning and execution or implementation among agencies of government, particularly the Department of Agriculture. Although I'm not saying that all the issues have been closed, because there are still a number of pending contentious issues in agriculture for which we have not reached closure. I started saying a while ago that I've been a student of agriculture for a long, long while. And from where I stand, setting aside natural causes over which we have no control, I associate or ascribe our poverty in the countryside and underperformance to 4 root causes. And the most serious liability, as far as I'm concerned, is our small economic-sized farms. Schumacher, in his book, Small is Beautiful, is romanticizing smallness. And it's good to look at it from that perspective. But smallness hurts because in almost all stages of the agricultural enterprise, we don't enjoy the economies of scale. We could raise productivity and reduce our cost by mechanization. And yet, the farmers cannot afford to buy tractors nor maintain them because of their small sizes. The farmers don't get credit because the banks do not lend to the small farmers because the cost of lending and the risks are high. In fact, all of our government programs have been designed. How do you cope with that reality of small-sized farms? The second major cause of our poverty and underperformance in the countryside, from my point of view, is that we have not adequately linked primary production with the markets and the rest of the value chain. This divorce between physical farming with markets is played out every year, every season, when farmers complain of very poor farm gate prices, even as the cost of food in the markets are the same, because we have failed to link primary production with markets and the rest of the value chain. The third cause of our poverty and underperformance is our failure to diversify to other value products. We have kept faith with rice and corn and coconut, where the yields or incomes per hectare are much less. But our ASEAN neighbors have wisely diversified into fruits, vegetables, industrial tree crops, and even ornamentals. And lastly, as I've said, we have not exploited to the fullest our vast resources for fisheries and aquatic resources. So how do we move from there, looking forward? There are a number of strategic directions which I think we should consider very seriously. We should operate the farms as larger management units, as cooperatives, irrigators associations, and agrarian reform communities. Meaning we have to keep on and persevere in developing our co-ops as a way of getting around the smallness of our farms. However, since the thousands and thousands of cooperatives that we have organized and farmers associations, most of them are not really working, then we have to reconsider how we are delivering services to those farmers associations. And my proposal is that we should consider privatizing the provision of management and financial control expertise to the Farmers Association from NGOs and from private consulting firms, rather than relying exclusively on the regular agencies, which sadly are not really doing enough. So we can privatize as an additional mode the organization and management of farmers associations, and these service providers should be paid based on performance. The next strategic direction, and which is quite contentious, is that let's declare victory in agrarian reform, grant the land titles to the beneficiaries, and lift the limits to land ownership to free the land markets. Agrarian reform has two objectives, political and economic. And the history of agrarian reform starting from the days of Solon in Greece, Tiberius in Rome, the French Revolution, the Mexican Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution. In almost all these agrarian reforms, the reformers succeeded in their political objectives of remaining in power. But almost all of them failed in the economic objectives. And I think this is true as well with our agrarian reform. Since we have distributed 8.3 million out of 9 million hectares, or 93%, let's declare victory and move on to address the issues of economic productivity. And part of our recommendation is give the lands to them, give the titles to them, because the farmers are not able to pay anyway. And besides, that will put to rest the iniquity between the reform beneficiaries who get their lands free because they happen to be public lands versus those who are supposed to pay because the land were compulsorily acquired from private sources. In terms of rice self-sufficiency, this national policy has not really worked for us, except for a year or two during the early Marcos years. We have failed to attain self-sufficiency in rice. But the other problem is that the resources we have devoted to rice could have been more profitably devoted to other crops by way of diversification. And the problem also is with the ASEAN liberalization, cheap rice will come from Vietnam and Thailand. So the problem really is not producing more rice, but producing a rice which is competitive with the cheap imports. And the only way to do this is to concentrate our rice production in the favorable areas with better water control, with hybrids, fertilizers, and mechanization in order to further drive down the cost to become competitive with imports. Conversely, this means that the less productive rain-fed lowland and upland areas for rice should be diverted to higher value fruits, vegetables, industrial tree crops, and ornamentals. We should also have more processing and value adding in the countryside. We should raise our investments in fisheries and aquaculture and help the poultry and livestock industries by securing their source of raw materials for feed and strengthen quarantine services. But most importantly, the private sector in poultry and livestock says the government should leave us alone. We could do better without government, except that Mr. Duterte should stop smuggling. Anyway, that in full is my overview with very specific recommendations on our strategic directions. I cannot resist making a comment on the agri-industry roadmaps. You know, I'm called attention to the divorce of primary agriculture from the food and beverage manufacturing sector. Primary agriculture accounts only for 12% of our GDP, but the food and beverage sector, which depends on the raw material on agriculture, accounts for 28%. And somehow we don't make that connection because agriculture develops its roadmap for primary production, but the Department of Industry takes care of food and beverage manufacturing. We should bring these two agencies together because after all, that's the same value chain. We should develop integrated agri-industry roadmaps moving forward. And then finally, on those contentious issues, in a way, I have mentioned intelligently managing our obsession with rice because we are really obsessed with rice. But I can add only here is that instead of looking entirely in the area of more rice, we should look more imaginatively on how do we substitute other things for rice. Because we have brown rice, which is more nutritious and has a higher recovery of 10%. Imagine if all of us will eat brown rice, that 10% higher milling recovery will cover all our shortfalls in rice. And then many of us, at least the Cebuanos, prefer corn grits. And corn grits have lower glycemic index. So it's good for diabetics. And it's cheaper. Except that we don't have a program to improve white corn production. Our yield in white corn is 1.75 tons, and our yield for yellow corn is 4.17 tons. And so our white corn farmers are shifting to corn because of the better technology from yellow corn. And maybe some of you will ask me about GMOs in the open forum. Thank you.